Hello everyone, my name is Sam. I am a trained chef, mushroom farmer, and co-founder of Earthling Mushrooms in Bangkok, Thailand. Today we're gonna cook some of these mushrooms and teach you a little bit about mushroom cookery in general. Mushrooms are considered vegetables, yes, but they're quite a bit different than all the other foods in that category. In fact, mushrooms are more genetically similar to humans than they are to plants. Mushrooms are made up of different compounds and they react differently to time and temperature. This video covers the basics and a little bit of the science behind mushroom cookery. It's not a list of recipes, but rather a list of tips and tricks to get you started with experimenting on your own. First things first, let's talk about how to get the most shelf life out of your mushrooms in the refrigerator. All mushrooms should be kept in the refrigerator between 0 to 2 degrees Celsius or around 32 to 36 Fahrenheit. Mushrooms that are sold at the grocery store like this, where they're totally closed off, typically they're gassed, meaning they add gas into the packaging like nitrogen to keep the oxygen off of the mushrooms and keep them from spoiling. We always prefer to keep mushrooms in paper packaging, whether that's a paper box or a paper bag. This allows the mushrooms to breathe and prevents moisture from building up within the container, which will cause spoilage. Different types of mushrooms have different shelf lives. For example, lion's mane can be stored in the refrigerator for up to about 2 weeks before it starts to look a little ugly. Oysters, on the other hand, about 7 to 10 days. Mushrooms like white button mushrooms that are sourced from the grocery store typically have a shelf life of only about 4 days, but that's because they're about a month old when you get them. So before you put your mushrooms in the refrigerator, you do want to clean them. Not all mushrooms have to be cleaned. Typically, button mushrooms and button mushroom relatives like portobello or cremini do have to be cleaned because they're grown in manure. Whereas mushrooms that are grown on sawdust, like lion's mane and oyster varieties, do not really need to be cleaned. So to clean them, you want to avoid using water entirely. Do not get them wet. Instead, take a dry paper towel and just brush off the top. But you'll see that it still kind of leaves a little bit of an ugly skin on the top. If you want to take it a step further, you can peel them. Clean button mushroom, dirty button mushroom. So any specks of manure or any of the substrate has been removed. Enzymatic browning in mushrooms happens when they are cut or bruised, which exposes the phenolic compounds to oxygen. Enzymes like polyphenol oxidase catalyze the oxidation of these compounds, resulting in brown pigments. So you can see here that there's a little bit of browning under the cap of this oyster mushroom. That's because it's been bruised and now the enzymes are reacting to the oxygen and turning it brown. And especially here, these mushrooms have been harvested and then picked apart into these clumps, and where they were bruised, it's starting to brown. To minimize enzymatic browning, you can use acidic ingredients like lemon juice or vinegar, which will lower the pH and inhibit enzyme activity. Additionally, you can cook the mushrooms soon after cutting, which will reduce the browning. Chitin is a fibrous substance that forms the structure of the mushrooms. It's found in fungi cell walls, exoskeletons of insects, shells of crustaceans, teeth of mollusks, and beaks of cephalopods. Structurally, it's similar to cellulose, but it includes nitrogen, which makes it more complex. Chitin's toughness makes it indigestible in its raw form. Now, cooking mushrooms breaks down the chitin, making the nutrients within the mushrooms more accessible and easier for our bodies to digest. This process releases vitamins like B complex and D, and essential minerals like potassium and selenium, along with bioactive compounds like beta-glucans, which have immune-boosting properties. Okay, so we've talked about the best way to store your mushrooms. Now let's talk about how to make them taste good. So this is some lion's mane mushroom. We'll harvest this off. As I was saying before, you don't have to wash these or anything. This is ready to cook as it is. To break them down, we really don't have to do anything special. You can just kind of pull them apart with your hands like this. It'll create some rustic little florets, almost like cauliflower. So to break up the oyster mushrooms, it's kind of the same thing. Just pull them from the cap all the way down and they pull almost like string cheese. And this stem here is edible too. The entire mushroom is edible. This is a little bit more woody, so I'm not gonna go all the way to the bottom, but I'll continue to pull this apart here. So this is lion's mane, pink oyster, and blue oyster. They're all broken apart and ready to cook. Something interesting about mushrooms is that they're about 90% water. So before we try to attempt to get them crispy, let's get some of that water to render out first. So to do that, I'm gonna put them into a dry pan, add salt, and then we'll turn on the heat. And we're gonna watch that moisture start to render out, and then it'll evaporate. It'll leave us with partially cooked mushrooms in a dry pan. Then we'll add the oil and get them crispy. The pan may look like it's overcrowded, but that's totally okay with this method. Usually when you're pan frying something, you don't want to overcrowd the pan because the items will start to steam each other. And it only smells like mushrooms in here. Mushrooms are super fragrant, especially when they're farm fresh like this. You can see that a lot of the moisture has been rendered out of the mushrooms. They've decreased in size by about 50%, I would say, at least. So all the steam coming off of the pan is moisture that was inside of the mushrooms. It does smell kind of funky. Mushrooms in a dry pan, no oil, no butter, no garlic. But it's a unique, good smell. It kind of smells like the farm, to be honest. So I'd say we're pretty much there. And then I think we're ready to add butter now. Some nice butter. Most of the moisture's gone. Let's go in a little bit of butter. You can see the mushrooms are starting to brown quite a bit, starting to smell more roasty, starting to smell more umami and less straight farm funky. Starting to get a little crispy. And the way I pulled these apart, they're kind of like gonna be crispy and stringy, almost like shoestring potatoes. So I would say the most important thing about making mushrooms taste good is achieving that Maillard reaction. And the Maillard reaction is a chemical reaction that occurs when amino acids and reducing sugars in the mushrooms are exposed to high heat. This reaction produces hundreds of new flavor compounds, giving cooked mushrooms that rich, savory flavor that they're famous for. At this point, you can taste it a little bit, adjust the seasoning, add a little bit of salt. But here's that Maillard reaction I was talking about. So it's brown, it's crispy, it's super flavorful. It's almost nearing like mushroom chip texture, which is what we want. And that's gonna be a lot more flavorful than eating a raw mushroom. Okay, so I took the mushrooms off the heat. Gonna finish it with a little bit of lemon and some parsley. That's good to go. And this is what the mushrooms look like all finished. But really, it's kind of just, I could almost see it as a bar snack, you know? Lion's mane mushroom is probably my favorite mushroom, and there's a couple reasons why. First of all, obviously it doesn't look like a normal mushroom. It doesn't have the cap and stem type build. So it provides a lot of culinary versatility. You can cut it into different shapes. You can cut it into a circle shape to resemble a scallop. You can cut it into a steak, which we're about to do, or you can kind of just break it apart and cook it like a normal mushroom. The flavor is super unique. No other mushroom has this flavor. No other food has this flavor. It kind of tastes like crab without the seafood kind of ocean flavor. So it has the sweetness and the butteriness without any of the funky seafood. So this is a lion's mane cluster. The whole thing is one cluster of mushrooms. Each of these little lobes right here are individual mushrooms. So when they grow up, they kind of all mold into one big cluster. So when I'm selecting a piece of lion's mane that I want to cut into a steak, I don't want to grab, a bunch of these small little mushrooms. I want to grab a big sized lobe like this, so that when I cut it into a steak, it doesn't fall apart. So I'd say that's a good piece of lion's mane to cook as a steak. It's like all these striations here almost act similarly to like muscle striations. It's like muscle fibers. Right now it feels kind of like a light foamy texture, but as we cook it, it'll reduce in size, it'll flatten, and it'll get a lot more like meaty, chewy, which is what we want. We want it to resemble a real steak. We'll salt it on both sides, or at least this underside before we put it down. So we're gonna do dry pan for this. No oil, no butter. We're gonna let some of the moisture render off of it and evaporate before we add any sort of fat. This is gonna be a thin one, but that's all right. This is like a lion's mane cutlet. Yeah, skirp steak. All right, should we add some butter? Yeah, just a little bit. Just a touch. We really don't want to drown the whole thing. Yeah, we do. Yeah.